Recently, Computing Forever made a video about franchises that got woke and went broke. I will explain what that means in a minute, but his video was mostly limited to films and TV shows. So I thought I'd quickly throw together this list of games that got woke and went broke. Most of this is pulled from One Angry Gamer's Get Woke, Go Broke master list. I'll put a link in the description. However, One Angry Gamer has a much more strict set of rules for what does and doesn't get on that list than I used for my list. Which brings me to definitions. For a game to be considered woke, it has to have some kind of shoehorned in representation or social justice politics. Usually this means forcing politics into a game series that previously didn't have them, or changing a game via updates to make the game more in line with progressive values. I know a lot of this is subjective, but it's easier to do than trying to put a strict set of rules on it. For example, there's a difference between forced diversity quotas and simply having a lead character that is not a white male. If we use that definition, then this list would end up full of JRPGs, platform games and other non-woke games. Then there's the definition of broke. One Angry Gamer is very strict when it comes to his definition of broke, saying that a game or company has to be a complete financial failure, which is why his list is so light. My definition of broke in this context is much lighter. Not every company advertises their failures because it doesn't look good. Companies might also try to spin a failure by saying it will make its money back in the long term. You see this with films when they say that it will make money on DVD, streaming, the Chinese market and through merchandise. Another tactic is to report the gross revenue of a game or a film without mentioning the costs that it took to make it. Another common spin trick is to say something overly specific, like, we're the fastest selling mature rated game in the third quarter release window. They could also straight up lie, but I won't get into that. But it's because of these reasons that I will use a perceived general downturn in sales or reception as my measure, and yes, this is completely subjective. Journalists are unreliable due to being biased, audience ratings are unreliable due to bots and fanboys, and as mentioned, self-reports of success aren't reliable or are easily spun. Finally, I want to address two common criticisms I see of the idea of get woke, go broke. First is the criticism that these games didn't fail because they got woke, they failed for other reasons and just happened to get woke, and that correlation does not equal causation. And if you made that criticism, you'd be completely right. Getting woke doesn't mean that a game has to be bad, but this has happened enough that there does seem to be a correlation. In my opinion, this is due to putting more effort into sending the right political message instead of making a good game. A great example of this is Mass Effect Andromeda. Instead of making a game that was fun and well written, the devs seemed to spend a lot of time virtue signaling on Twitter and making woke NPCs. The second criticism I see a lot is that this game was woke and that it was a success, therefore you're wrong. That's not entirely accurate. As mentioned, simply having a lead character that is not a white male does not make a game woke. Neither does having Nazis be the bad guys. Also, some games are already a success, then the wokeness was added later. Skullgirls is a great example of a game that was a big hit, and then after the game was a success, the devs went back in and removed panty shots from the game. You can't exactly unbuy a game years later. Their next game was meant to be out earlier this year, but it hasn't come out as of the making of this video. So with all that out the way, let's get onto the list, starting with the honourable mentions. There are many games out there that were woke and went broke, but for whatever reason aren't going to be on the list proper. First, let's talk about walking simulators. Games like Gone Home and Dear Escher have enjoyed their 15 minutes of fame, but the bottom fell out of the genre with a glut of bad games like Everybody Has Gone to the Rapture, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, and Sunset being considered failures. How bad do you have to be to try and make a game with no gameplay and still mess it up? I don't know, but they managed to do it. Another honourable mention goes to all the woke Kickstarter scams. Games like the extra credits funded Mental Drift, which was never released, and Zoe Quinn's Chuck Tingle game, which raised over $80,000 on Kickstarter and has yet to come out. She has never explained where the money went. The game was also promoted by Jim Sterling, who has also never said anything about the game. You can't really say these games are woke because nobody's ever played them, and you can't exactly say they went broke because they never came out. Another honourable mention goes to all the games that were localised by hack translators who wanted to rewrite the games to be all about their own politics and favourite memes, or was simply censored during translation. Then there's games that were released and have had wokeness patched in after they were a success. I already mentioned Skullgirls, but Overwatch is another example of a game that was a hit, and then Blizzard started retroactively making characters' gear, adding a Middle Eastern map that portrays it as a utopia, and so on. They also seem to abandon a Valentine's Day event with Genji and Mercy because Tumblr took offence to the idea that straight people were in the game. Finally, I want to mention a couple of games that I'm told are woke but don't seem to meet my criteria for wokeness. First is Mafia 3. The game was a broken mess on release, and I don't know what's woke about it, and I've not played the game. Like I said, simply having a black lead character isn't enough to make the game woke in my opinion. The same goes for Prey. I have played Prey, and in that game you could choose a male or female character, and the female character is a lesbian. Again, I wouldn't consider that woke, though the virtue signalling articles about it were fairly cringy. Now, onto the list proper, in no particular order. Let's start the show with a showstopper, Mass Effect Andromeda. As woke a game as you can get. As already mentioned, the lead devs seem to spend a lot of time on Twitter virtue signalling, and according to some, they hired people based on their Twitter following and having the right opinions. The game was a huge disaster. The women were all ugly while the men were not so limited. Facial animations didn't work or were simply awful, and the game was full of bugs and glitches. Battleborn is an Overwatch clone that went woke and got broke. Apparently the tutorial has you playing as a strong female refugee of colour. The Vice article about the game says, "Battleborn isn't perfect, but it's really cool to see a game's story focus so purposefully on two women developing respect for each other and coming together to take down a megalomaniac dude, which is directly opposed to more shooters' emphasis on guys with guns." The game was a flop. Lawbreakers was another character-focused multiplayer shooter that took great pride in its inclusion of gender-neutral toilets. The game was crushed by the Overwatch train. Wildstar was a game with many problems and had a laundry list of flaws, but choosing to make the female characters less sexually appealing instead of fixing those flaws didn't help. The game shut down in 2018, 4 years after they got woke. Hyperuniverse is a game that censored some stuff, and the game lost a bunch of players. The game started issuing refunds and then shut down in January 2019. Bless Online is apparently an MMO that censored some stuff. The game is shutting down in September 2019. I should mention that those two games announced that they would shut down about a year or two after they started censoring themselves. Agents of Mayhem. Coming off the success of the Saints Row games, Volition would have a tough job following those games. They opted for a single-player, character-swapping third-person shooter with a G.I. Joe kind of vibe. It could have worked, but the action was stiff and awkward. The cast of characters is a cringy Burger King Kids Club diversity fest, with a Muslim ninja being one that is singled out for derision. For me, it was the muscly dyke on roller skates that was the most eye-rolling. This game is one of the weaker examples, to be honest. Uncharted 4 added a sassy black woman villain who was impossible to beat in a fight. They also turned Nathan Drake into a henpecked worm and ended the game with Drake having a daughter instead of a son. The game is considered worse than the previous ones. I don't know if it's true, but I heard Naughty Dog kicked the female lead writer from the project for not being woke enough and added a male lead writer to take her place. So much for diversity. Battlefield 5 thought it would be a good idea to take their authentic World War II multiplayer game and add female cyborg snipers with cricket bats on the front lines, alongside guys in crazy face paint with katanas. The players said the game was stupid and DICE told them not to buy the game. It was a flop. Similarly, Call of Duty World War II allowed you to play as black female Nazis on the front lines of World War II. Speaking of World War II, after the success of Wolfenstein The New Order and Wolfenstein Youngblood, Trump was elected president. Those two things aren't related, it's just establishing a timeline. This caused the European devs to rework the sequel. The game included a black female communist as a hero and more cutscenes than gameplay. The game sold way less than the previous games. Just recently they released a sequel, Wolfenstein Youngblood, which removed the game's male lead and replaced him with his two daughters. The game got mixed reviews on Steam, and while it's too early to know the sales numbers, people don't seem to like it. Yooka-Laylee, a throwback to N64 platformers like Banjo-Kazooie, featuring a cameo by JonTron. After JonTron said some controversial things on a podcast, social justice warriors demanded JonTron's cameo be removed from the game. It was. The game was generally considered a disappointment and not very good. In contrast, A Hat in Time, which was a similar throwback 3D platform game with a smaller budget, also had a JonTron cameo and kept the cameo. The game was well received. Unfortunately, A Hat in Time kind of proves the point of Get Woke or Broke, as they released a DLC for the game that included trans pride flags hidden as Easter eggs, and criticism of the flag Easter egg was banned from the forums. Their next DLC has mixed reviews on Steam, with reviews complaining about a lack of content. Also, as an aside, I want to include this comment from someone on Reddit.
I thought this was marketed as an N64 style collectathon game. I must have missed the area in Banjo-Kazooie with hidden references to what people in certain circles are doing with their private parts.
Mortal Kombat 11. People like me remember when Mortal Kombat was considered edgy and cool. Now they are so spineless they removed the OK symbol from the game because they believed a ridiculous 4chan hoax that the OK sign was a white power symbol. Dead or Alive was a fighting game known for its big bouncing busts. After years of being smeared by the game's press, Dead or Alive Extreme Volleyball 3 was never released in the West, with importers being threatened by former members of the game's press. Dead or Alive 6 covered up the women for the most part. Of course, those complaining had no interest in the game, so all covering the characters up did was drive away fans that liked that stuff. Finally, there's Dishonored 2. The first game helped revive the first-person PC stealth genre. Anita Sarkeesian criticised the game for being sexist, and the developers were stupid enough to listen to her. They hired a gender studies major to write the expansion. The expansion was not well received, and the sequel would go on to be a flop. And with that, I think this list is complete. Let me know in the comments if I missed any.